The Shatt al-Arab waterway is not a famous body of water. It does not carry the strategic weight of the Strait of Hormuz or the historical resonance of the Persian Gulf in the language of global energy security. It is a river, the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, running south through the flat agricultural plain of southern Iraq before emptying into the northern Gulf near the city of Basra. It is narrow, navigable, shallow in places, and bordered on both sides by terrain that offers almost no concealment for anything larger than a single person moving carefully. It is also, at its southern terminus, the only maritime access route for the oil loading platforms at the port of Basra. Platforms that move approximately 3 million barrels of Iraqi crude oil per day into the tankers that carry it to refineries across the world. 3 million barrels per day. A number that exists as an abstraction until the platforms stop loading and the abstraction becomes a specific shortage in a specific place at a specific price. On March 12, 2026, the Iranian government was looking for abstractions to make concrete. 14 days into Operation Epic Fury, the Islamic Republic had sustained a degradation of its military capability that its own commanders were describing in communications that American signals intelligence was collecting as severe. The aerospace force was operating at reduced capacity. The Navy's surface combatant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-conflict strength. The ballistic missile inventory was being carefully rationed against a resupply timeline that was not favorable. The one instrument that Tehran had not yet fully deployed, the network of Iranian-aligned militia forces operating across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, was still largely intact, and its commanders were receiving authorization to act with a freedom of operational initiative that the preceding years of calibrated restraint had not permitted. The authorization was not for a military target. It was for the oil. At 11:17 p.m. on March 12th, 2 commercial tankers were operating in the approach waters to the Basra oil terminal. The MV Altair Pacific, a Liberian-flagged crude carrier in the final stages of its loading approach, and the MV Serendeniz, a Turkish-flagged product tanker holding in the anchorage area awaiting its berth assignment. Neither vessel was a military asset. Both were operating under the flag and the protections that international maritime law extends to commercial shipping in waters that are not declared combat zones. The Shatt al-Arab approach had not been declared a combat zone. It was contested in every practical sense of the word and protected in no practical sense. But the paperwork that international maritime law requires had not been completed. The attack came from the western bank. The weapons used, rocket-propelled grenades, and what the subsequent investigation assessed as a modified anti-tank guided missile system, were not sophisticated. Their guidance requirements were minimal. The range from the western bank of the approach channel to the hull of a fully loaded tanker proceeding at 4 knots on a straight-line approach to its berth was not a ballistic problem that required advanced targeting solutions. It required presence on the bank, weapons, and the decision to fire. The MV Altair Pacific took 2 hits in rapid succession at 11:17 p.m., one below the waterline in the forward cargo hold section, one above the waterline on the port side superstructure. The below waterline hit began an ingress of water that the crew's damage control team could not stop with the equipment available to a commercial vessel's safety kit. The above waterline hit started a fire in the accommodation block that was generating significant smoke within 4 minutes of impact. The crew, 23 personnel of mixed South Asian and Eastern European nationality, had initiated their abandoned ship protocol at 11:19 p.m. The MV Serendeniz, 400 meters away in the anchorage, had detected the impacts and was already repositioning away from the attack bearing when a third weapon struck her stern section at 11:20 p.m. The hit was below the waterline. It was not immediately catastrophic. It was sufficient to disable the vessel's propulsion and leave her drifting in a channel where a drifting vessel of her displacement is a hazard to navigation and a fixed target for anything on the bank that has ammunition remaining. 39 crew members were in the water or on emergency rafts in the approach channel at 11:22 p.m. The distress calls from both vessels had been received by the Iraqi Coast Guard station at the Basra port complex within seconds of the initial impacts. The Iraqi Coast Guard duty officer had immediately contacted the American liaison element embedded at the port facility. A small naval advisory team whose presence at Basra was the product of a security cooperation agreement that had been in place for 3 years, and that, in the preceding 14 days of conflict, had become significantly more operationally relevant than any of the parties to the agreement had anticipated when they signed it. The Naval Advisory Team's senior enlisted advisor received the call at 11:21 p.m. He had 7 personnel with him at the liaison facility. The Iraqi Coast Guard had 2 patrol boats at the dock. The distance from the dock to the position of the stricken vessels was approximately 3 nautical miles. The western bank of the approach channel, the bank from which the attack had come, was Iraqi territory. The militia forces that had executed the attack were, according to the immediate reporting from the Iraqi port security monitors, still present on that bank. Whether they had additional weapons and the intention to use them against recovery vessels was a question that could not be answered from 3 nautical miles away. The senior enlisted advisor assessed the situation in the time it took him to walk from the communications room to the dock, which was 41 seconds. He had 2 options. He could request air assets and wait for a response that the watch officer at the CAOC in Qatar would authorize in approximately 8 minutes, by which time the 39 people in the water would have been in the water for 10 minutes, in a channel whose current was carrying them toward the open waters of the northern Gulf and whose temperature at night in March was cold enough to produce hypothermia symptoms in unprotected personnel within 30 minutes. Or he could get on the boats. He got on the boats. He transmitted his movement to the liaison facility's communications channel at 11:23 p.m. A single transmission giving his position, his heading, the nature of the emergency, and his request for any available air support. Then he and 3 of his personnel split between the 2 Iraqi Coast Guard patrol boats, and the boats left the dock at 11:24 p.m. The approach to the casualty position took 6 minutes. During those 6 minutes, the CAOC watch officer in Qatar received the transmission, assessed the request, tasked a flight of 2 MH-60S Seahawk helicopters from the USS Bataan, an amphibious assault ship that had been operating in the northern Gulf as a part of the force package supporting operations across the theater, and transmitted the tasking at 11:26 p.m. The Seahawks were airborne at 11:31 p.m. Their transit time to the Basra approach channel was 14 minutes. The patrol boats reached the casualty area at 11:30 p.m. What the senior enlisted advisor found when his boat entered the area was a picture whose components he identified in sequence with the trained attention of someone who has learned to read a chaotic situation by sorting it into the categories that determine priority. The MV Altair Pacific was listing heavily to port, her bow already low in the water, the fire in her accommodation block generating a smoke column that was visible from the dock they had left. The MV Serendinese was drifting broadside to the channel current, her stern visibly low, no lights on her superstructure. Personnel in the water were clustered in 3 groups. one near the Altair Pacific's emergency rafts, which had deployed correctly and were providing flotation but no propulsion, one in open water between the two vessels, and one that the patrol boat's searchlight located when his Iraqi Coast Guard counterpart swept the beam southward, 60 meters further downstream than the other groups, suggesting personnel who had entered the water before the rafts deployed and had been carried by the current. The western bank was 300 meters to his left. It was dark. There was no incoming fire. The absence of incoming fire was not the same as the absence of threat, and the senior enlisted advisor was aware of this with the specific awareness of someone operating in a space where the threat's intentions are unknown and its remaining capability is unquantified. He made the decision that the situation required and that his training had prepared him for. He assigned the Iraqi Coast Guard boat to the main raft cluster, took his own boat to the open water group, and transmitted the position of the downstream group to the CAOC for the Seahawks to address on their arrival. The recovery of the open water group took 11 minutes. 8 personnel, 3 with injuries, 1 with a laceration from the debris of the impact that had opened a wound on his forearm requiring pressure to manage, 1 with apparent smoke inhalation whose respiratory distress was worsening in the cold air, 1 who had struck something in the water and was reporting pain in his lower back that he was managing by not moving. The senior enlisted advisor's corpsman moved between the 3 injured personnel with the systematic efficiency of triage. Stabilize the laceration, monitor the respiratory case, immobilize the back injury, keep all 3 warm and out of the water. The patrol boat was not a medical platform. It had a first aid kit and a blanket locker, and 2 people with medical training and the knowledge that the Seahawks were 9 minutes out. The corpsmen worked within those constraints without expressing frustration at them because the constraints were fixed and the patients were not. The respiratory case was the variable that concerned him most, the one whose trajectory was heading in a direction that the equipment on the boat was not capable of reversing. He kept his attention on the breathing rate, on the color, on the small indicators that experienced medical personnel learned to read as a language that the body uses to announce what it intends to do before it does it. The breathing was labored but regular. He reported the status to the senior enlisted advisor at 11:34 p.m. and 11:37 p.m. Both times the assessment was the same. Deteriorating slowly, stable enough for the 9 minutes remaining. The Iraqi Coast Guard boat had recovered 19 personnel from the main raft cluster by 11:38 p.m. and was moving toward the Altair Pacific to check for remaining crew aboard when the western bank opened fire again. The weapon was different from the initial attack. Not a rocket-propelled grenade, a heavier caliber automatic weapon, firing tracers, the rounds impacting the water between the Iraqi Coast Guard boat and the drifting Altair Pacific in a pattern that was not aimed at the boat, but was close enough to it to constitute an effective warning to anyone aboard who had considered closing the distance. The Iraqi Coast Guard crew reduced speed immediately. The boat commander transmitted on the emergency frequency. The senior enlisted advisor, 400 meters away on his own boat, received the transmission and assessed the situation. The western bank had identified the recovery operation and was attempting to prevent access to the stricken vessel. 2 personnel were still aboard the Altair Pacific. The crew's abandoned ship account, transmitted via emergency satellite phone by the vessel's master before he entered the water, had listed 23 personnel. 21 had been accounted for in the water. 2 had not been located. The Seahawks arrived at 11:43 p.m. The lead Seahawks crew assessed the fire from the western bank within seconds of arrival and established a holding pattern that kept the aircraft outside the effective range of the weapon, while its thermal sensor located the source of the firing. The source was a position on the bank approximately 120 meters from the water's edge, concealed in a drainage ditch that the thermal imaging resolved as 2 personnel with a crew-served weapon. The Seahawk crew transmitted the position to the CAOC at 11:44 p.m. and requested weapons release authorization. The authorization was issued at 11:47 p.m. The Seahawk released its AGM-114 Hellfire at 11:52 p.m. The firing from the western bank stopped at 11:45 a.m. The second Seahawk moved to the downstream position and began recovering the personnel that had been carried by the current. 4 crew members from the Altair Pacific who had been in the water for 24 minutes and whose core temperatures, when assessed by the Seahawk's rescue swimmer after extraction, were consistent with the early stages of hypothermia. All 4 were conscious. All 4 had maintained their flotation. The rescue swimmer transmitted their condition to the Baton's medical team in real time during the extraction, beginning the treatment sequence before the aircraft had completed the recovery. The 2 personnel still aboard the Altair Pacific were located by the lead Seahawk's thermal sensor at 11:46 p.m., both on the vessel's starboard bridge wing above the accommodation block fire, where they had retreated when the fire cut off their access to the main deck ladders. The vessel was listing at 17 degrees, and the list was increasing as the forward hold continued to flood. The bridge wing was no longer a survivable position. The Seahawk crew assessed the extraction geometry with the compressed urgency of a crew that has done this calculation before and knows that the variables do not wait for a considered pace. The rescue swimmer was in the water at 11:47 p.m. He reached the vessel's hull at 11:48 p.m. and climbed the emergency ladder to the bridge wing where both personnel were waiting, a first officer and an engineer, both conscious, both mobile, both experiencing the specific combination of relief and disorientation that follows an extended period of extreme fear and the sudden arrival of someone with a plan. The rescue swimmer had 2 sets of rescue hoists and 1 aircraft above him, and a vessel that was going to continue its list until it reached a point where the bridge wing was no longer accessible from above. He moved fast. The first personnel was hoisted at 11:49:30 p.m. The second at 11:44 p.m. The rescue swimmer was recovered at 11:51:18 p.m. The MV Altair Pacific rolled past 30 degrees of list at 11:53 p.m. and continued. She came to rest on her port side in the shallow water of the approach channel at 12:04 a.m., blocking the berth approach for the Basra loading platform. The MV Siren Deniz was taken under tow by the Iraqi Coast Guard at 12:11 a.m., and removed from the navigation channel by 1:30 a.m. The Basra oil terminal suspended loading operations at 11:25 p.m., 8 minutes after the initial attack, before the recovery operation was complete, because the Port Authority's security protocol required suspension of all vessel movements in the approach channel when an attack on that channel had been reported and not yet resolved. The suspension remained in effect for 19 hours, while Iraqi security forces cleared the western bank and the channel approach was assessed for additional threat presence. 19 hours at the Basra terminal is not an abstraction. It is a specific number of barrels of Iraqi crude oil that did not load onto tankers. It is a specific signal to the markets that we're already running the arithmetic of the conflict's effect on global supply. The Iranian planners had achieved exactly what they had authorized the militia commanders to achieve. Not the destruction of the terminal, not the permanent interdiction of the approach channel, but the interruption, the demonstration that the infrastructure of Iraqi oil exports was not insulated from the conflict by its geography or its flag, or its status as the product of a country that was not a party to the war. 39 crew members had been in the water or on rafts in the Shatt al-Arab approach channel. 39 were recovered. One was in surgery at the Baton's medical facility by 12:30 a.m. The respiratory case, whose smoke inhalation had progressed during the recovery to a severity that required intervention beyond field management. The procedure was completed at 2:17 a.m. The patient was assessed as stable. The senior enlisted advisor filed his activity report at 3:45 a.m. It was concise. It documented the timeline, the personnel recovered, the coordination with the Iraqi Coast Guard, the requests transmitted and the responses received, the condition of the injured personnel at the time of transfer to the Seahawks. It noted that the Western Bank had opened fire during the recovery operation and that the fire had been neutralized by the Seahawks AGM-114 engagement at 11:44:52 p.m. It did not describe the 6 minutes of transit from the dock to the casualty area in the dark, with an unknown threat on the Western Bank and 39 people in the water at the end of the transit, and the specific quality of the decision made in 41 seconds of walking time that had put him on the boat rather than at the communications console waiting for authorization. That category of description does not belong in an activity report. It belongs in the kind of silence that exists after an operation where the thing that was supposed to happen, the recovery, the completion of the mission, happened, and the people involved understand that it might not have. The approach channel to the Basra terminal was cleared and reopened at 6:22 p.m. on March 13. The first tanker since the attack completed its loading and departed at 9:41 p.m. The oil moved. It moves because people get on the boats when the boats need to leave, when the bank is dark and the authorization is pending and the people in the water do not have 19 minutes to wait for the answer to arrive. The Shatt al-Arab carries what flows into it toward the Gulf, indifferent to the conditions of its passage. The men who moved toward the fire on its surface that night were not indifferent. They were deliberate, which is a different thing entirely, and the thing that made the difference.